Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Major Richard Fawcett. I'm currently working as an emergency doctor in Chester. Excuse me if I appear a little tired. I've just come straight from a night shift. My special interest is pre-hospital care, and currently I've done 3 tours of Afghanistan. Recently got back in March, where I was doing the MERT, which is the helicopter retrieval job out there. Through my time, I've managed to experience all roles of the medical chain of evacuation out there. Back in 2007, I was involved in Role 1, working with the Grenadier Guards down in Garmecia. The Role 2 in Tentage Field Hospital. 2011, I worked in Camp Bastion in the emergency department, and like I said before, I've just returned from doing the helicopter retrieval job out there. So today, I'm hopefully going to give you a little bit of an insight into how sort of the RAMC, the military kind of medical evacuation chain has progressed and, shall we say, developed from the First World War right up until sort of what's happening today in the modern warfare, such as Afghanistan. And hopefully you'll be able to see the leaps and bounds and the progress that the military has made. There will be time for questions at the end, should you feel like you would like to ask any, or if you want any clarification. Hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions. So a quick overview of what will be involved within this talk. Brief introduction, looking at the pre-hospital care back in the beginning of the 1900s, when the First World War started, how it's improved over the years, and then spending a bit of time looking at the battlefield today. And from there you'll see some pictures. They do show patients, actual patients, so there is some injuries there. Some very short video clips that were taken from Afghanistan as well. Leading right up until what the MERT is, which is seen as the basically gold standard for pre-hospital care throughout the world. You know, the UK sort of medical evacuation chain, should you say, is now looked at as the leading kind of sort of specialists in this subject. The Americans don't have anything like it. During my last tour, they spent a lot of time trying to come across to try and copy us, but due to the way that their kind of medical assets are distributed, I don't think it's going to be a long time before they can do that, because they don't put doctors pre-hospitally. And then finally, we'll just summarize, and then should you need to ask any questions, that can be at the end. So I think basically this is a very kind of significant and poignant point. Most battlefield data, and in fact civilian data as well, will reflect this, that basically the first 10 minutes is the most critical time for a patient, okay? It always used to be looked at the golden hour, and then that became the platinum 10 minutes. And research has showed, especially sort of from Vietnam time, stuff like that, that basically the biggest difference to a patient outcome will be made in the first 10 minutes from penetrating trauma. And that's to do with whether a casualty is going to bleed out, or whether you can stop that bleeding and potentially save their life. And that's really how the main focus of how sort of pre-hospital care and trauma resuscitation has progressed through the years. And you'll see that now when we get onto how the MERT works and how resuscitation happens nowadays, how that's a real focus on what happens today. So, with the outbreak of the First World War back in 1914, the RAMC, which is the Royal Army Medical Corps, was less than sort of 20 years old, having first sort of been conceived back in the Boer War. Now, with the Boer War, there was a very much trial and error. There were sort of isolated treatment facilities, not really supporting each other, which led to casualties being stagnated and lots of complications happening because of this. But this was very quickly realized, and very quickly, with the outbreak of the First World War, people realized that you can't just hold patients in sort of small tentage areas with limited resources. Those patients who need sort of definitive surgery, who need ongoing care, they need to be evacuated back to your specialist center, to your big field hospitals. And this was sort of implemented very quickly on from the First World War. So right from the 1914, we can see the concept of having sort of forward aid stations, and then that sort of, and the progression with the field ambulances to create evacuation bringing them right back to what was then called the casualty clearing station and the main field hospitals. So this is a picture having a look at sort of the very stagnated trench warfare. So not very easy to transport people backwards and forwards. Most of the evacuation was done by hand, stretcher bearers, constantly in the line of fire, constantly putting themselves out to go into no man's land, drag people out. So a slow process, a labor-intensive process, and a very dangerous process. And thankfully, you know, the stretcher bearers were a soldier's kind of lifeline, really. You know, they were putting themselves in harm's way to go forward, collect the wounded, and retrieve them back to what was then an RAP, which stands for a regimental aid post. Now, the concept of regimental aid post still exists today. In fact, most FOBs, so your forward operating bases, your patrol bases, they will have a junior doctor there who operates out of an RAP. And the RAP basically is a small setup with a couple of trestles, sort of a couple of treatment bays, with sort of with immediate life-saving equipment. So they'll carry sort of fluids and antibiotics and the ability to stem some massive hemorrhage and stuff and things like that. So normally the first kind of proper treatment that a patient would receive would be at the RAP. And this kind of concept has remained with the RAMC and the military sort of medical services through the last 100 years as well. It's been a little bit refined with the equipment and training that people get, but the core concept is still there. If you look to the diagram to the side here, this is a kind of a brief overview, really, of how sort of a commander of a medical sort of section, or would you say like the whole kind of medical planning of a battle group would organize their setup, basically. And if you look at the very top at the front, that's the trenches, basically, where you'd have your infantry brigades. Attached to them would be your sort of corpsmen, your bandsmen, your stretcher bearers. They're there doing basic first aid, and they'll evac down the trenches, pulling people on stretchers short distances back to the regimental aid posts. From the regimental aid posts, they will feed back into an advanced dressing station, which is maybe a tentage or a building, which is bigger, can maybe hold sort of 20 casualties plus, more resourced, in a slightly safer location. You know, you're out of direct fire by the time you get back there. And then progressing further back via ambulance. To begin with, it was horse-drawn, and then as the war progressed, motorized, mechanized vehicles came online, sort of improving the efficiency. And they would take you back to a casualty clearing station, which would be more like one of your field hospitals they are today. From there, you would then use a sort of a more stable, sort of more efficient mode of transport, such as a train or a barge, and that would take you back to your stationary, very large sort of field hospitals, which would be situated in one of the cities that was occupied by sort of Allied forces. And from there, if needs be, they could then be repatriated back to the UK. Now, depending on, I mean, this is all based around a very linear warfare, which is what World War I was, and it's very similar in World War II. The changes with today is that linear battlefield has disappeared. There's, you know, if you take example of Afghanistan, it's a very fluid, dynamic battleground. There's no trench warfare. There's no, you know, there's just pockets of areas which are held one day by the Taliban, next day the civilian, and you know, it's a very kind of fluid, dynamic battleground that you can't really rely on this evacuation. And for speed and efficiency, you'll see when we come onto it later, the medical evacuation has changed such that you now just skip right from either the point of injury, where the soldier is injured on the battlefield, so actually in the middle of the firefight, or from the regimental aid post straight back to the sort of big field hospital. And that eliminates a lot of these steps here. But for when this was conceived, this was the most efficient way of trying to ensure that the maximum number of casualties received treatment and try to and try to have a survivable outcome. So if you look at the top picture there, that's what your regimental aid post would have looked like in the trenches. So very confined, cramped, small spaces, very small capacity, not really a holding area. It's really kind of that life-saving treatment. And then moving back to like I say, one of the either forward sort of surgical units or one of the MDSs, which you can see below, which would, if they could have a hard standing, such as inside a building, they would, just to give more sort of protection and shelter from the elements. As it says there, the advanced dressing stations, they're served by 3 or 4 RAPs. So every time you get to something bigger, it's fed into by several smaller sort of consignments of medical treatment stations. And you know, with them all ending up in the casualty clearing station, which, if you look at today's scale, would be something like the equivalent of the field hospital that's in Camp Bastion at the moment. So that kind of big scale sort of hospital. So a quick oversight of how medical evacuation evolved very quickly just in the first few years of the First World War. So you can see there sort of bicycles and horse-drawn carriages trying to evacuate patients. But as probably many of you will know from history, with the the rain and the prolonged sort of occupation of the various countries, this led to most sort of roads, tracks, etc., becoming very unpassable, and so it was very quickly recognised that mechanized sort of vehicle ambulances were needed, and this was implemented within sort of the first year of the war breaking out, and made a big difference to the evacuation chain and the survivability of casualties as well. So again, if you look at the pictures, starting with the top, that's sort of more your advanced dressing station. So a much bigger scale, more beds, safer environment, more treatment being offered there. So they would have a surgical ability there. They'd be able to do amputations, anesthetics. They'll have some sort of recovery there. Patients will be able to stay there for a longer time, either to be turned around and sent back to their units on the front line, or once stabilized then and fit enough to make a further journey, be moved back to a casualty clearing station. And casualty clearing stations would have the ability to almost take up to 1,000 people at one time. So we're talking large numbers. But if you think back to the First, Second World War, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people getting injured. So fortunately, unlike today's battlefield, I think we'd struggle to cope with those sort of numbers today. But at that time, they did a remarkable job of coping with overwhelming numbers sometimes. So once they got to the casualty clearing stations, so once they were sort of, the decision was made to whether these patients would be sort of turned around, have their injuries sorted out there, maybe spend a week or so being rehabilitated, a couple of weeks. They could either be turned around and taken back to active duty, or say they had a devastating injury that was going to take months and months of treatment or rehabilitation, then they could be moved back to the larger sort of hospitals within either the major cities looking to take back to the UK. And that would be done by, as you can see here, either the trains or the barges. And these are specially fitted trains that were converted to carry medical equipment, carry stretchers, have the ability to do ongoing care while they were being evacuated, sometimes very long distances back to, for example, to France to make the journey back across the UK. As it says there, nearly 750,000 wounded men were evacuated from the casualty clearing stations by trains, and another nearly 20,000 by barges. And that's just on the Western Front alone. So we're talking massive numbers. As you can see there was initially 4 ambulance trains, which went to a total of 28 within 2 years. So a very kind of well-utilized resource, a very busy resource, but yeah, an effective resource for that time. So, as we progress, with the advent of the Second World War and the advancing technology in transportation, so speeds up the evacuation of patients to more definitive care. As you can see here, there's the hint of the air evacuation and the concepts of that. So this became really important within the Second World War, where with the spreading of the war into the desert and sort of the limited supply chains and the long distances between sort of towns and cities, became the sort of limiting factor that, say, a large hospital has of power, water, sterilization, resources, and thus sort of restricting where you could place them. And sometimes this could be many miles from the front line. And this had a significant impact onto those people planning like where the battles were going to be and how to evacuate their wounded personnel. One of the ways to do this was to formulate the concept of the mobile field surgical units. And these were sort of mobile, sort of little teams of surgeons, anaesthetists that can move forward and do damage control surgery. Well, the beginning of concepts of damage control surgery, basically stabilization forward nearer to the battleground to buy that extra time to improve the survivability, to then move the patient back some 50 plus miles to a larger hospital where maybe more definitive surgery could take place. And this concept was something that was then taken and basically used right up until within the last 10 years. And it's a concept that's still taught now, and it's something that, depending on how the platform of the theatre of war you're in, it's a concept that can still be used nowadays. It's a very fluid concept, and it's something that does work well when you're limited to how you evacuate your patients, and as well as where you can site your sort of larger sort of field hospitals as well. And as we were talking about before, with the introduction of the motorized ambulance and that increased speed of evacuation going from the horse-drawn cart to now a vehicle, and eventually to the introduction of fixed-wing aircraft, and eventually that of the helicopter, that created a much more faster, effective way of moving those patients who are critically ill and in need of that more sort of interventional treatment from those more specialized, more skilled, who would be kept in the main hospital rather than those pushed forward who would have limited resources. And that introduction of, especially of the aircraft, started to make a big difference in survivability of injuries as well. And that started to become apparent towards the end of the Second World War. So, as with any war that develops, medicine, as well as the development of arms, etc., especially with medicine, you see leaps and bounds in concepts and developments of treatment patterns and how to sort of improve patient survivability far quicker than in any other sort of environment. And I suppose the advantage to come out of war is that all these advances that are made in wartime within the medical field can then be reflected back within civilian practice. And that's become extremely apparent in the last 5-6 years from all the lessons learned in Afghanistan. The trauma care that you now receive back in the UK, most of it is based from lessons learned there. And if you were to be involved in a traumatic injury, say 10 years ago, the care you would have got then would have been very different to what you'd receive now if you went to a UK hospital. And most of that is reflected on what people have experienced over there and have brought back and then relayed and passed on to their civilian colleagues. And unfortunately now you can see that within the care you'd receive if you went to hospital today. Part of that is, you've probably seen people walking around shaking buckets for your local air ambulance charity. And a lot of that stems from the military introducing sort of well, first of all, the fixed-winged, and you'd see that if you were in Australia, but because we're a small island here, we just stick to the rotary, the helicopters that you'd, for the pre-hospital care. And they made their mark made a big mark in the Korean Wars back in the 1950s. So this concept of helicopter evacuation, that's been around for 60 years now, and still every year more concepts are learnt, more skills are taught, and more developments are made, both within civilian and military practice. As I've already alluded to, modern wars, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, that have probably you've taken note of in the media for the last sort of 10, 15 years or so. That's something that's been quite close to a lot of the people within my unit, within anyone involved in the military. You probably know. I would be surprised if you didn't know someone that's been there, or a family member that's experienced that. The kind of the dangers to the soldiers today are very similar to the dangers of World War I. The basic kind of medical ballistic injuries, that of sort of a round, a flying bullet, or that of an explosion and flying shrapnel, affects the body today the same way as it did sort of 100 years ago. The body itself hasn't changed. Fortunately for us nowadays, our body armor has improved, so our sort of protection has got better. However, if you're unfortunate enough to be involved in an explosion, or if you're unfortunate enough to be hit by a round that misses your body armor, you're going to sustain an injury similar to that of 100 years ago. The only good thing nowadays is that your experience as a patient will be vastly better than that of 100 years ago. And that's important because most of the people, well, a large majority of the people who would experience this injury 100 years ago, there's a high chance they would have sort of succumbed to their injuries at some point during their evacuation. Whereas today, there's a very high chance that they will survive that injury. Even those injuries deemed unsurvivable, they, with a very high sort of trauma score, which predicts how fatal an injury is. There's lots of statistics coming out of Afghanistan showing that due to a lot of early interventions, these people are making remarkable recoveries. And some of that is down to their pre-hospital care, some of that is down to their hospital care, and some of that is down to their Role 4 care when they come back to the UK. So, the latest concept, so I alluded to slightly earlier, the MERT, which is the Medical Emergency Response Team, which you might have seen on the news or in the media, is the Chinook, so the large British helicopter that flies around with a medical team on board, flying around, picking up patients from the point of injury and bringing them back. They basically consist of a 4-man medical team that comprises of a nurse, 2 paramedics, and a senior doctor, either from an anesthetic or an emergency medicine background. And their job really is to offer advanced care to that patient to try and stabilize them in that short window of time they're being flown back to the hospital. Because as we said on the first slide, the first 10 minutes is the most critical time. And that's where lives are lost or saved sometimes. So, the battlefield today. Just going to show you a very short clip. This is taken some live footage, well, some clips put together from my time on the front line back in 2007. It just gives you an insight into, well, actually, comparably, it's probably the conditions are not that far off from trench warfare, but as you'll see from the kit that the people are wearing, it's a very different type of kit, and there's a lot of components within that try and prevent and help reduce the impact of injuries they might sustain.
Opal 510 this is Opal 1 Alpha, a sit rep. We've had 4 times explosions 100 metres to our rear. We are taking multiple small arms incoming on this position. We've got a HE coming down on the position of Frog Eye. We're receiving a major muzzle flash and a PID of enemy forces in that area. Get the enemy right out.
So, as you can see, a very loud, a very sort of unsafe environment, a very difficult environment to work in. And that's the kind of situation that a lot of soldiers have found themselves in the last few years. And should they be unlucky enough to get injured, as you can see from the environment, not a very easy environment to evacuate a patient. And that's why when we went into Afghanistan, the concept of the MERT was born. So the MERT is a very, although the kind of the platform, the concept of the medical emergency response team has been around for a while, the actual MERT today that was formed for Afghanistan. And that was because, as you can see here, very rugged, very poor infrastructure, very difficult to evacuate patients quickly back to definitive care. And so this idea was born to basically move the resuscitation, move the A&E department forward and provide that immediate care from the point of wounding. And that way, you know, even though, as you can see the terrain here, very hostile, very difficult to work in, you know, you're eliminating all of that by basically pushing forward your A&E department to the patient rather than bringing the patient back to the A&E department in the hospital. So, thinking about the soldier today, every soldier that's in the UK within the military is trained to a basic level of first aid. It's called there's something called MATS training, and that's sort of basic training for every soldier that they have to fulfill every year. And within that, there's first aid, there's battlefield casualty drills. Everyone carries a quick flip chart that they can flip through, which, you know, at the time of need, when things, you know, if they need to use it, they've got a quick reference guide. They're all skilled in doing buddy first aid. And for a lot of people, it's the buddy, you know, it's not the doctors, it's not the nurses, it's the guy next to him that will save his life, because he will provide that tourniquet on that leg that's been blown off, or he will put that pressure on that wound. And, you know, that just buys him an extra few minutes before a medic even gets to him. And that's made a big difference as well with the development of, like I said, the tourniquet and some of the advanced sort of dressings that we use now to try and stem massive bleeding. So it's not just about what the doctors do back in the hospital, it's about what every individual soldier does on the ground as well. And that's made a big difference to people surviving injuries that they wouldn't have done, say, you know, 20 years ago. Within each sort of small team of soldiers, there's also a team medic. Now that team medic, he's basically like an infantier, so he'll be an infantry background, but he'll have gone on a slightly longer course, and he'll have slightly more medical kit that he carries. And there will be one within every small team that goes out. As well as the team medics, then say a section's gone out of 8 to 10 people, within that section there'll be a combat medic tech. Now, the combat medic tech is the first properly trained medic that you'll come across within that group. So the combat medic tech is kind of on a par with what your paramedic would be like back in the UK. So they're able to do sort of medical interventions, give drugs, things like that, start the resuscitation there. Within each company, forward will be a regimental medical officer or a GDM, or a junior general duties medical officer, and they will be situated in the FOB, so the forward operating bases or the PBs, the patrol bases. And they're the first doctor that a casualty will come across, assuming that the patient is evacuated back to the sort of the regimental aid post, and that's where you see this concept of the regimental aid post all the way back from the First World War still being utilized today. And again, that regimental aid post is a very similar structure. In Afghanistan, it's 2 trestles in a room with the ability to give analgesics, such as morphine, with the ability to give antibiotics, with the ability to give fluid, with the ability to try and stabilize that patient a little bit more while you're waiting for the patient to be evacuated by the MERT. However, there's also the chance that patient might bypass that altogether and just be picked up straight away from the point of wounding. So from that field, whether they're shot or where they're blown up, the helicopter has the ability to land straight on their point of wounding and take that patient straight there, therefore bypassing every element of the patient evacuation training that we saw from the concepts of World War I. And then once they get to the MERT, so more resuscitation will take place, and then they'll be taken back to the field hospital. Now within Afghanistan, well, within southern Afghanistan, within the Helmand region, that field hospital would have been Camp Bastion that you'd have seen on the news. That was a UK-led hospital. There were some US-led hospitals as well, but within Helmand, where the UK was operating, that's where the soldiers would have been taken back to. And then from there, they would have been taken back to the UK via another type of airframe, different to that of the sort of the pre-hospital care. They'd have been taken back by fixed-wing aircraft, so again, still pulling concepts from 50 years ago, back to the UK on the CCAST. And that's the critical care sort of side of it, the ongoing stabilization of the patient for more definitive care back in the Royal 4 Hospital back in Birmingham that you're probably aware of. So, in any commander, so commanders who are not medically trained at all, a medical plan is always at the forefront of their mind when they're thinking about any concept of ops. Because at the end of the day, they want to know that if any of their soldiers get injured, they're going to be able to do whatever they can to evacuate them to try and sort of get them better. And within that, the concept of installing this medical training to every soldier and then having multiple layers of training within each sort of level within the section has come about. And as with the concepts that have come out in the last sort of 10 years, catastrophic hemorrhage, that control of the massive bleeding, that is now the top priority. And that's filtered back to, within civilian trauma nowadays. So that takes priority over the airway control and everything else. So controlling of that limb that's missing, getting an early tourniquet on, and then taking care of the airway, then taking care of the breathing, then taking care of the rest of the circulation. And these are concepts that, 10 years ago were not even thought of, and now, this is like what is taught to every single soldier. And that's how much things have advanced just in the last 10 years, never mind the last 100 years. So, when a soldier is injured on the ground, there needs to be a decision to be made. Does this patient need a helicopter back to the hospital, or can he just be walked back to the FOB for the regimental medical officer to see him? So, if it's decided that the patient's been severely injured, for example, if they've been shot, blown up, something like that, then very quickly the commander on the ground will make the decision that this patient needs to go back to hospital. And as soon as that decision's made, they'll make a radio call and they'll start the process. As soon as Camp Bastion, where the people controlling all the airframes, the airspace, etc., receive that call, they'll then start allocating resources. So within Afghanistan, the British, we had the MERT, the Americans had Pedro and Dustoff, which are different platforms. Their platforms are the Black Hawks, which are mainly staffed by sort of paramedic type personnel. So depending on the severity of the injury and what sort of coalition force they were, so if they were UK, then pretty much all UK got repatriated by the MERT. Some US would have been evacuated by either MERT or their Pedro or Dustoff. And depending on the severity of the injuries, if it was an Afghan or something like that, will depend on what airframe was launched. And like I say, the advantage of the MERT, which was used for all UK personnel, is the fact that we carried this senior doctor that had the ability to do advanced resuscitation, not capable by some of the American colleagues that are out there. So this is kind of what it looks like in the back of the helicopter. So unlike our airframes in the UK, which is used for civilian evacuation, this is a very large helicopter, lots of space, the ability to do ongoing resuscitation, which is not possible in the airframes in civilian practice. I'll try and show you a very quick clip. Oops. So this clip's slightly old now, but this is the airframe that we were using. And when you see inside, you'll see it's a big sort of area to work in, which is what makes the MERT, one of the reasons that the MERT is an effective platform for this. So what is MERT? So the Air Publication 3394 defines it as an airlift for patients between points within the battlefield, from the battlefield to the initial point of treatment, and also onto subsequent treatment within the combat zone. Which basically means that it's a platform to carry a patient from one point within a battlefield to another, whether that's from the point of wounding to a hospital or to another medical facility. The advantages of MERT over that of any other platform was really the highly trained emergency sort of doctor or the anaesthetist that headed up the team and was the ability to offer sort of the advanced anesthetic sort of intensive care side to the patient, as well as the ability of the helicopter to carry sort of up to 8 units of blood. So you can start your massive transfusion of the patient if they've lost a lot of blood from that point that they get loaded onto the helicopter. For example, if you were involved in a trauma in the UK and you came in, it would take you, within most A&Es, it would take you about half an hour probably to start getting some blood because they have to get it from the lab. They need to bring it down to A&E. It's a bit quicker if you go into a major trauma center, but they're quite sparse. So if you went to your local hospital, say in Chester or say Whiston or places like that, then you would need to, on average, 20 to 30 minutes maybe before you'd actually have that blood hung and going into you. And that's after you arrive to the hospital. Here, we could have 8 units into you within about 6-7 minutes of you being on the helicopter. And that made massive differences to people. From my own personal experience, I saw people who came on the back of the helicopter who were basically dead because they'd bled out from their wounds. Within a few minutes, having poured lots of blood into them, their heart was pumping again. They were making a respiratory effort. That was a patient that, had we not been carrying that blood, that was a patient that would have died. And that's just something that you just can't replace with anything else. I mean, that was just amazing to see as a practitioner and stuff. But also, we carried kit that was enabled us to warm up the blood, to warm up the patient, special blankets that have been designed that have heating elements in them. So even though you're working in a desert in the summer where it's very warm, patients, because they're in shock, they've lost blood, they come on very cold, they need to be warmed up. All these little things that people have thought about over the years to improve patient care, these are all things that have made a difference and improved their survivability. As I said before, having that clinician there to be able to do a rapid sequence induction, which is the ability to put the patient to sleep and take over their breathing by putting a tube down and putting them on a ventilator, that makes a big difference to the patient's sort of experience as well. It puts them out of their pain, it puts them out of the stress on the body of having to try and struggle to control their breathing, etc., especially if they had a chest injury or if they'd lost a lot of blood. And these were all things that help stabilize the patient, help improve their survivability. As well as just having this very large platform that you could fit up to 8 stretchers on at one time, or you could do a 30-patient lift if they were walking wounded. This is a massive platform to work on, and it gives you the maneuverability to be able to work between patients and provide that level of care. So when the casualty is wounded at the front line, a 9-liner is sent. That's that radio message from the guys on the ground back to Camp Bastion saying, we have a casualty, we need you to send an air asset to come and pick us up. So if it's a UK guy, the MERT is activated and they're sent. In flight, so most of the time we'd be scrambled, you'd be on the helicopter, you'd be flying out, you wouldn't know what you'd be going to because you just go. You don't hang around waiting for updates because every second counts. On the way you're flying there, you might get an update, how many casualties, what might be their injuries. So you can start to prepare your equipment, all your drugs, everything's pre-drawn anyway, so it's a very efficient, sort of very fast, very kind of definitive way of working. As soon as you land, normally the guys are there ready. Now, sometimes the guys might be packaged, so the casualty might be already have sort of some treatment done on the ground, or the casualty might not have anything, depending on how quickly you've been able to get there. But with the advantage of having a four-man medical team, it means that no matter what state the patient came onto, within a few minutes, the patient would be at the same state, whether they came on fully packaged or completely nothing done for them. With 4 people working on them simultaneously while you're flying back to Camp Bastion, they'd have all their kit off, they'd be exposed, they'd have all their sort of lines in so they can get drugs and blood and be rewarmed. And by the time they landed at Camp Bastion, say if it's a short flight of 10 minutes, that patient a lot of the time would be fully resuscitated with blood, they'd be asleep, intubated, on the ventilator, pain controlled, breathing controlled, circulation controlled. So whereas if you think back to World War I, these people were being treated in a regimental aid post, they're being held there, then held somewhere else, every time sort of a stationary static position, with the advantage of flying a patient in the MERT from point of wounding is every second you're treating that casualty, you're flying them back to the hospital. So even if you didn't do anything for them, every second you're with them, you're 1 second closer to bring them back to the hospital. And that in itself is a very important point as well. So once you land back at Bastion, using Afghanistan as an example, so once you land back at your kind of large field hospital, you have a very quick unload, so the helicopter doesn't shut down or anything like that. As soon as you touch down, the ramp goes down, the patient's offloaded, put straight in the back of an ambulance, as you saw briefly on the video, and driven straight to A&E, which, for example, in Camp Bastion was about 200 meters, 300 meters. So a very short distance, just literally far enough away from the helicopter landing zone that it's safe for them to land, and then whisk them straight through the front door where you've got a waiting resuscitation too. So, one of the key concepts that's been sort of developed throughout the last 100 years and is core to that of pre-hospital care, both civilian and military, is the idea of delivering the right patient to the right place at the right time. And that ensures that no matter how sick a patient is, that they get the appropriate treatment at the right time. So if you've got someone that's only got a minor injury, then they've got more time. They can be treated at a lesser established place like a regimental aid post. On the other hand, you've got a very sick patient who's got several limbs missing, who's bleeding out. Then you have a very fast evacuation chain for them with very experienced level practitioners going to a very well set up field hospital, say for example Camp Bastion. And that's like that core concept, that idea is what drives sort of the medical planning and the medical setup of the pre-hospital care and the concepts within the modern sort of warfighting stage at the moment. And it's this concept of MERT, which was developed for Afghanistan for basically the platform that's used today, even though it was Afghanistan-centric, it's as it's worked so well, you'll probably see it reflected in wars to come, that it's that ability to project the emergency room forward. So it's that ability to put like a mini accident emergency department on the back of a helicopter and push it to the patient to where they've been injured. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, now to improve on that. unless you basically put an operating theatre on there as well, and an intensive care unit, I don't think, I find it quite difficult at the moment to see how we're going to improve on that. But I'm sure time will tell. Like I say, every year that goes past when there's a conflict going on, the advances in medical care, especially trauma care, is astounding. And like I say, every year that I've been back, I've seen massive leaps and advances. And it, like I say, it's amazing to see how far we've come just in the last 10 years, never mind the last 100 years. So I'll just invite if anyone's got any questions at all.